Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrel Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Canadian writer Ryan Murdoch. If you go to ryanmurdoch.com, you'll see that he's been writing about travel, culture, and the world's marginal places for over 20 years. He was the editor-at-large for Outpost magazine, and he's the author of Vagabond Dreams, Road Wisdom from Central America. He's the host of the Personal Landscapes podcast, where he shares his love of travel literature and classic books. He joins me today to talk about his career as a travel writer and his latest book called A Sunny Place for Shady People. Ryan, it's a pleasure to speak to you today. I want to start by asking you a question about your first book. You described your character as secluded, distant, and even puritanical. How did that person that you were in the late 1990s walk away from his job and fly down to Central America to begin this backpacking journey in search of freedom?
Oh, it's a long time ago. I was obsessed with martial arts as a teenager and into my 20s for about 20 years there. So I became very serious about that, and everything was about, training all the time. And we drank a lot of beer in high school, like most Canadians at that time period in the 80s. Mm-hmm. But by the time I started training, I kind of got away from that and became obsessed with that pursuit to the exclusion of pretty much anything else. So I didn't have much fun in university from that perspective. I read a lot, and I'm pretty introverted to begin with. So I think taking a trip like that was a way to balance that. I could see that was maybe a problem, being far too introverted. And that's why it took 10 years to write honestly about it. I mean, I rewrote until I wasn't like the cool character the hero of the story anymore. There was this naive idiot who a lot of things happened to that I didn't expect. Yeah, I think it was a kind of a deliberate attempt to get out of that shell. And it was, I wanted to write for as long as I could remember, but I didn't have anything to write about. Like the things around me didn't interest me at home. They do now, looking back at it from a distance, but at that time you have to go. I agree with Paul Theroux. You have to go away to find your subject and to free yourself from that. So it was taking a Greyhound bus trip around the States right after university kind of showed me that this could be a topic. And finding Paul Theroux's writing, somebody recommended The Happy Isles of Oceania to me around that time, and Chatwin's songlines. And when I read that, I thought, wow, you could actually go out and have adventures and write about that. That's pretty interesting. What I thought I would be writing about down there didn't turn out to be the story, but so I think it was more a kind of a deliberate attempt to break out of that sort of travel to balance the introversion of, a reading and kind of writing life, basically. Still the same. I spend most of my time just in this room and then take off to someplace abnormal and try to talk to people and become, find a story in those places.
That trip in Central America, you started in Panama, right down at the Colombian border, and the plan was to travel all the way up to Belize, and you did that. I'm interested in how you made the decision as a writer to say the story is in Panama and Costa Rica and Nicaragua, and that's how you chose to tell this story. So you went through 3 other countries to finish this trip. So how did you make that decision as a writer?
Well, the book was far too long, for one, but I worked with a developmental editor because I knew something was off with it, but I couldn't figure out what it was. And she read it, and she told me I had like 6 endings. And each time I'd see notes from her as she went through the manuscript, and it would say, oh, this is a great ending. Oh, no, this is also an ending. And so is this down here. And I realized, she said, you should just cut this last, 1/3 or whatever it was that I had written. I'm sure it was over 100 pages. And as soon as I heard that, I thought that's exactly right. I didn't have any trouble cutting it because I knew suddenly I could see the conception of the story. I knew it kind of patterned on to the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell writes about. Not that I would saw myself as the hero, a mythological hero of the story, but I studied anthropology at school, and that structure kind of spoke to me where, you get this call to adventure and you go off into a strange place. You meet somebody who's sort of a guide and who helps you. And I could see some of the lessons took the place of that pattern or took the structure of that pattern. And then at the end of the journey, it changes you in a way, but your task then is to come back and bring the knowledge, this hard-won knowledge, back to the society you left and somehow do something with it. So that story was basically done by the time I left Nicaragua, and the rest was just kind of, parts of it were boring, parts of it just kind of droned on. Other parts were self-contained stories that I published as articles later, that were just interesting in themselves. But it wasn't. That was the big problem with a book like that. How do you tell what's the story and what's not? And I realized I don't need to tell the whole thing. In the one sense, writing a travel book is easier, and because you've got a journey to map onto, it starts here on a map and ends there. But that's not always the story. The story is something else, and you have to carve away what doesn't fit. You can still use bits of it for other things if you feel bad about throwing it away, but I never had a problem with cutting stuff like that. It's when you see that that's the right answer, you just know it is.
Sometime during that time, you also started writing for Outpost magazine. What is Outpost magazine?
It's no longer with us, but COVID killed that off. The website's still up, but I believe COVID killed it off like so many other publications. So back then it was a Canadian print magazine. It would have started in the very late 90s, maybe, or early 2000s. And they published long-form articles, narrative travel articles. So not like how-to stuff or the kind of glossy magazine filler stuff, but actual journeys. And that was sort of unique at the time. It was on newsstands across Canada, but I don't know. Occasionally they made inroads into the States. I'm not sure how much they published down there. So I started writing for them. Would have been 2005, I did my first story for them. So sometime after that journey, it was a bit of a roundabout way, but I kind of broke into features directly by shortcutting the process. When I was living in Japan teaching English, I was working on the first draft of that book, and I wanted to start building up some publications, but I didn't want to spend years doing the sort of front of the book filler, the anonymous little filler stuff they make you do usually. And by just a fluke, a trip, the vacation plan that fell apart and went wrong, resulted in me finding an opportunity to get into North Korea in 2001, at a time when it wasn't so easy to get in there. And I knew it took all the savings I had. Like I just bundled up all my cash in a plastic bag and gave it to some guy in Pyongyang. But I knew that I would be able to see the inside of a country that was still fairly closed then, and I would have something to write about. So when I got back from that trip, I leveraged that into a newspaper column, and it was just for my hometown. I mean, it's not a big deal, but they gave me a byline and a column. And then when I pitched my first feature article to Outpost, I said, well, I'm a newspaper columnist, they don't know the name of the thing. They have no idea. So I was able to jump straight into features, but the feature I submitted got rejected at first. And then they changed editors, and somebody called me up like 8 months later and said to you, is that still available? Can we use that? We got an opening. And it ended up getting nominated for a magazine award that year in Canada. It was about the Taklamakan Desert, a camel journey into the Taklamakan. So once I'd broken in with the first feature in Outpost, after that, they started calling me for assignments, and I worked with them for about 15 years, I think, just writing everything from the book review column to the annual global travel guide. I did a lot of features. This was the tail end of the golden age when they would still send you places, and that kind of stopped partway through. So after that, you're kind of on your own dime, but and that's gone now.
I read one of your most recent ones where you did Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia.
I was in Malta still. So maybe 2015. I went by car through those 3 Baltic states just because it was a corner I'd never been to. And I thought, let's see what's there. And it turned out to be incredibly interesting. And then we took, my wife was doing the photos, and we took a ferry, Baltic ferries, across to Finland, over to the Åland Islands, kind of a strange independent territory. Across to Stockholm, down to Gotland, and kind of around the whole Baltic Sea. And I wrote separate articles about some of those, but yeah, those little 3 countries, they were very different, each one. All bore the scars of the Soviet era. And there were interesting literary connections. Thomas Mann lived on the Curonian Spit in the summers in Lithuania. There were missile silos and bunkers all over Latvia from the Cold War. I wrote an article about one of these missile silos we got into, and I had an American friend who used to be a military guy, special operations guy back, 10 years ago or whatever. And he sent me a message and said, yeah, I targeted that during the Cold War. Like that was one of my assignments, was to write, if things go to shit, like how would I attack that facility and neutralize it? So
I spent some time teaching in Moscow 10 years ago. One of my favorite things to do in the city was, I think it was called Bunker 42, and you could go down into this Cold War era bunker, and it was huge down there.
wow.
And I absolutely loved touring through this thing.
There's a lot of that sort of thing here in Berlin, Cold War and Second World War history. The largest Red Army base outside the Soviet Union is south of Berlin, about half an hour by car, and it's an abandoned town basically, and you can still see like the gymnasium and these rotten buildings and the statue of Stalin and all kinds of stuff, and it's all fenced off now, but I mean, there are holes in the fence and you can poke around in there. So that was one of the most interesting sites from that period that I've been in around here. But yeah, that time period always fascinated me.
I spoke to a guy last year who started way up in Finland and worked his way down the Iron Curtain and wrote about it. Was
that Borderlands?
The book? No, that's Timothy Snyder.
Yeah.
This was Timothy Phillips, and it was called Retracing the Iron Curtain.
Oh, interesting.
And I think it came out maybe 4 years ago, but
I'll look for that.
Yeah, it was a good idea for a book. I liked it.
Yeah, that whole time period fascinates me.
I'd like to ask you how you were living in Canada with your wife and the two of you decided you're going to move to Malta. How did you choose Malta, and why did that happen, that you guys ended up moving there to live there?
Yeah, it was just a random fluke, really. Like at the time I was living in Tokyo, I became obsessed with the writing of Lawrence Durrell. I found him by way of Henry Miller. They were friends, and I started reading Durrell, and he's most famous for his novel sequence, The Alexandria Quartet. It's a fantastic work of fiction and modernist fiction. And he wrote these 3 Greek island books. So he was born in the Himalayas and was sent to the UK for school. His father died while he was in school. So his mother and brother and sister came to England, and they hated it there. So he convinced the entire family to move to the island of Corfu. And this was in the 30s when it was dirt cheap and nobody was doing this. And they had this crazy island life, he was learning to write there, and all these crazy characters came, and he wrote a fantastic book called Prospero's Cell about the culture, the landscape, and all this. And he was a big proponent of the idea of the spirit of place, that every person has a landscape or a place or a culture that resonates with them. And it's where you feel the most alive and where you do your best work. And for him, that was the Mediterranean. So I kind of got captured by that vision. I went to Croatia and the south of France and kind of looked around, and I loved the landscape and the olives and, the translucent sea. And I always kind of harbored the idea of going to a place like that and writing about it. Something inspired by Durrell's island books, but it had to be about a place that nobody else had done it already or nobody else had written about. Like I considered Sardinia, I think, and that's fantastic there, but it's Lawrence wrote about it. So you don't want to compete with that. And I just did an internet search and found Malta. The photos looked amazing. I thought, looks interesting. I knew about the Knights, and I've seen the Maltese Falcon a dozen times, which had nothing to do with the place. But I just thought, okay, that sounds like a good idea. And we were renting a house then. I convinced my wife to quit her job, and we just gave notice on the rental house, got a company. They come and they pack your stuff when you do an international move, and they send it for you. And just bought a ticket, one-way ticket, and said, give you an address in a couple of weeks. And then we flew over to look for a place to rent. And I figured we'd stay 3 or 4 years, I guess, but it ended up being 6.
So you're a Canadian citizen. How are you able to work out a visa to stay for that length of time?
I'm an Irish citizen as well. So I've got a European passport. So my grandparents were from Northern Ireland, immigrants to Canada. So I had taken care of that a few years earlier. I knew a guy when I was a kid who was a journalist, and he worked in France, and his mother came over on the boat with my grandparents, and he said, oh, he could do this because he's got this Irish passport. You should apply. So yeah, that meant we could live anywhere in the EU. Nice. So it's very easy.
Before reading your book, I didn't know much at all about Malta, other than a few basics. Could you give a simple overview of what and where Malta is?
Yeah, it's a tiny Mediterranean island country, an independent country, just south of Sicily. So it's about 30 kilometers long and 20 kilometers wide, with a little over 550,000 people crammed into it. So it's one of the most densely populated countries in Europe. And the landscape is very dry and stony, fairly deforested at this point. There are little pockets of trees. It's garrigue landscape, like the Mediterranean kind of garrigue that you would see in France. Small shrubs and thorny things like that, prickly pear cacti. There's not enough water for the population. So in earlier times, everybody had a stone-cut cistern under their house to collect rainwater, but it only rained in the winter. So it was arid, completely arid, not a drop for the entire summer. Very hot, just north of Libya, really. So, I mean, it's extremely hot in the summer. And then in winter, you would get the rains and hopefully fill your water reservoir. But due to its position in the Mediterranean, pretty much everybody conquered the place at one time or another. So the Phoenicians came, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Arabs, the knights, the crusading knights in the Middle Ages. Napoleon was there for a brief period, the British, and now the EU. It was a British colony for quite a long time. And you can find remains from all of those periods right outside your front door. So it's a bit of an archaeologist's paradise. And that was my favorite thing to do in those days. I had a couple archaeological guides. I would stick them in my pocket and go out and look for these things. And you'd find, the remains of a Phoenician temple somewhere just in the countryside. So it's a fascinating place. And it's a very strange mix of culture and history because of that historical position and its geographical position right, between the Straits of Sicily. So whoever was controlling Sicily had to control Malta, because otherwise it's a threat right off the island. And who wanted to control the sea lanes also needed to control it. So that's why the British were there. It was on the route between Gibraltar and the Suez Canal.
The journalist Christopher Hitchens, in his memoir, he says the earliest memory that he had would have been the early 1950s, was his family on a boat sailing away from Malta and going back to the
really?
British Isles.
I've got that book here. I'll look for that.
I think his father was in the Navy and must have been posted there for some a short amount of time. So.
Wow, the Queen was in Malta when she was first married as well. The Queen and Prince Philip. Yeah, she was there. The house is still there. It became very run down, but I think I've heard recently they're going to fix it up again. But that they spent their happy early years of their marriage in Malta.
What legacies are still left there from British colonial days?
British colonial days, the food. The food at the time there are a lot more good restaurants have opened now, but the food at the time I was there was sort of a mix of the worst parts of British and Italian cooking. Not traditional Maltese food wasn't like that. That was very good, but the typical food that everybody seemed to be eating was the deep fried side of British food and the pasta side of Italian food in gigantic proportions. So the British food legacy was maybe not a very good one that they left behind. What else? You can still find some fortifications from the Second World War. They're not very well taken care of. Like there are pillboxes around, and there was an entire fort I used to go to. It's just all dilapidated now. A few things like that, barracks, but much of that was kind of, they don't see the value in those more recent remains, I think, because the Knights of Malta overshadow everything. That's the most the dominant feature on the island architecturally. The fortified city of Valletta, the bastions, the towers all around the outside perimeter of the island, designed to watch for intruders coming over the sea, or the Turks, usually the Ottomans. So the British legacy, quite a lot of people speak English. The dominant modern influences would be a mix of British and Italian culture, depending on the time period and who you kind of identified with and who your family identified with. So they get a lot of Italian television too, so a lot of people speak Italian because it's the nearest thing, the nearest place. I mean, so the TV signal comes from there.
And it's a popular vacation destination for Europeans.
A lot of British people retire there. That's kind of their place in the sun. I knew a lot of British retirees. So it's a massive tourist destination from the UK because people speak English widely. From Germany as well. A lot of Germans like to go there. A lot of foreign workers were coming from Spain in the restaurant industry, and At the time we were living there, online gaming was quite a big hub in Malta because of the laws, the very lax oversight, and the tax laws are it's a bit of a tax haven. So there were a lot of online gaming studios, and they seem to have mostly Scandinavian workers, Scandinavian and Baltic, I think. But so like the gym that we went to at during the last couple of years of our stay, within that same building was an online gaming studio, and we'd see these dolled up girls in cocktail dresses in the afternoon in the gym, getting changed and stuff. What the hell is going on here? But they were running like a virtual casino, so people were betting from all over the world, and they were spinning the roulette table and stuff, and dressed up like they're at a cocktail party. But these things are kind of hidden away in some of these buildings there, and there were a lot of problems with those businesses and scandals associated with them, but that drew in a lot of young people from Scandinavia who'd come down for a couple of years, in the sun or whatever, and make a bit of money at these things and try to live the Mediterranean lifestyle. So that's what it was like, 8 years ago. I'm not sure now.
You and your wife didn't stay in the capital city. Tell me about the village where you two found your first place to live.
In the south part of the island. So if you look at the map and you see the airport, just go to the right of the airport on the map, and it's around there. Okay. All these villages sort of cluster together. It's because it's such a heavily populated place that you'll pass from one village to the next and not really notice it. But in the south, they were a bit more spread out. So that was quite an old village. The name Zaytun came from the Arabic for olive, although I don't think there are any olive plantations around there anymore. But it was surrounded by there were some farmers' fields around the periphery of the village. A very beautiful old core. The village core was really those winding medieval streets and a lot of Arabic influenced buildings there too. So I wanted to live in a village because I didn't want to live in just the kind of the expat seaside place. There's a town called Slima and St. Julian's where all the expats tended to cluster, and living in tiny flats and just talking to other foreigners. I wanted to live in a village, in part because I wanted to live in an older house to get a sense of the traditions there, but also just, I don't know, to experience the slow pace of village life and potentially, make some friends with the people who live there. That's a bit harder in a small village, but yeah.
How long did it take before you started to notice some of the strange or darker sides to Maltese society?
Yeah, it quickly became evident within a couple of weeks that much more is going on below the surface there. It felt very guarded, especially in the small villages. Like people sort of looked away when they passed you in these alleys, but I always had the sense that people were watching us all the time, and that one of my neighbors confirmed that too. He said that everybody knew who you were, like within a day of you moving in here, and they knew everything about you, where you came from, whether or not you're married, so the gossip network was quite efficient. But the most startling thing for me, on the first morning, I woke up jet lagged earlier than necessary, and I went to the village core for my first coffee. I'm looking for like a cafe I can sit at, and I walked into this place and said, "Can I have a cappuccino, please?" And the lady just looked up and said, "Nescafe?" So this threw me off. I thought, no, I want a cappuccino, please. I thought maybe she just didn't understand what I said, and she said, "Nescafe." Well, can't you use that machine right there? No, it's not on yet. It takes too long to warm up. The guy who's here doesn't make it yet. I realized that in all these cafes and these villages, everybody's just drinking Nescafe in a glass. Like they would just mix it up. So that this wasn't the cafe culture I'd expected. It was just tons of traffic in the village. It was quite noisy. The main square was very noisy. It was an incredibly noisy place, actually. That startled me. And they're the typical things that foreigners in Malta find hard to take, like the fireworks all summer long.
Yeah, you mentioned that early on in the book. They're called petards, is that right?
Yeah, the daytime fireworks. They're just designed to make a colossal explosion, and they set them off like from 8 a.m. It starts. During the village feast, it begins at 8 o'clock in the morning. This bombardment, and like they shake the walls. Dust comes down, and you really think like you're under attack from Libya or something. At the time, the civil war was happening in Libya, and I thought, this is it. They're coming. But and then they go on again at noon, and then around 4 p.m, another salvo, and then all evening. And like you can't even speak, it's so loud. You just forget about having a coherent thought. So this goes on for about a week, and then in your feast, it's the center of the Maltese summer in each village, and then it starts the next village over, which is right there. So it's almost like it's in your own. Those things tend to shock foreigners, and I don't meet too many people who enjoyed them, but it was more the watchfulness and the sense that things were a bit off. Like I started following the newspapers, and I'd see all these really bizarre crimes that people sort of acted as though they were normal. Like 2 old men were fighting over a parking space in Gozo once, I remember, and the sister island of Malta. And the other guy got the parking space, so the one old man just drove his old beater around the block to get some speed, and he drove over the guy and killed him. And when it finally came to the courts, the judges said, well, he was upset, and, it's understandable. They just, nothing happened to the guy. And there were all kinds of really weird things like that that were accepted as normal. And then there were also some sinister elements, like just after we lived in that place for about 2.5 years, and then we moved across the island to kind of downsize a bit. And the guy who lived down the block got shot in his doorstep just after we moved, like a week or so after we moved. And I used to see guys hanging around the front of that guy's door. Like all the buildings are all directly right up against the street, and the houses sort of present a blank facade. There are bars on the windows lower down, and the upper windows have glass, but the houses sort of face inwards around courtyards and stuff like that. They don't you don't have lawns or anything, so they're right up against the road, these little alleys. And there was always some weird guys hanging around that garage. They never smiled, they never said hello. And it turned out this guy was a bomb maker in the 80s, and he was still practicing his trade in his garage. So somebody just knocked on the door, he opened the door, and they shot him 3 times, and he died on the doorstep. And everybody knew. So oh yeah, he was a bomb maker. Everybody knew, but nobody saw anything that day. So you start to find out that, okay, well, this was from that period of political repression in the 80s, and these tensions still exist. It's a deeply divided society. And then you start to uncover more and more stories of, fuel smuggling and shady business all over the place. And the other thing that I thought was strange too, people were very friendly on the surface, but all the conversations stayed on that level. Even with people I knew fairly well, they only talked about sort of neutral things. Nobody would really talk about what they actually thought about what was happening in the country, or get too personal. They were very guarded. It was only after I left, or I said I was leaving, that suddenly people started opening up to me. So it was a very, very fearful, guarded society in some ways. So I sensed that there was a lot of mistrust in that sense.
While you were there, the Labour Party won back power after a long period of time. Is it right to say that sometime back in the 80s they were so scandal plagued that they were unelectable for several decades, and then while you were there, they finally got back into office? So what kind of changes occurred when there was a changing of power from one political party to the next?
Yeah, everything changed. That's when everything really started to change for the worse. Like before that, it was a sort of place where nothing worked very well very often. Everything sort of fell apart, but it was kind of endearing in the way that you just kind of cobbled together a solution, and it all sort of worked out in the end, and people were pretty relaxed about it. It was a place with no functioning traffic laws, and people were very human and forgiving. It's the opposite of Germany in the sense, like it's not a rule-bound society. So it was quite a much more pleasant place to live then. And then the Labour Party returned to power after 25 years, I think, in the wilderness. There was a period of political violence and repression in the 80s under this Prime Minister, Dom Mintoff. When he came in, there were strong class divides in the country. And when he first came in, he really did do a lot of good things for poorer people on the island. But at some point, it began to turn more and more authoritarian. And he tried to extort more money from the British for the rental of military bases there. And the British called his bluff and left, basically. So it left the country with an enormous cash shortfall. And he went on an around the world begging bowl tour. He thought, well, if you're not gonna dish up money, our former allies, then we'll go to your enemies to spite you. That's a very Mediterranean thing to do. So they went to China, to Mao's China, and to North Korea, and eventually Gaddafi became their main patron, and they had very close relations with Gaddafi. Like there was a Libyan military helicopter in Malta all the time. There were strange murders of Libyan dissidents that were covered up. The bomb that went on that Pan Am flight that blew up over Lockerbie, Scotland, that was put on an Air Malta flight in Malta and transferred, I think, in Frankfurt. So it was quite a dark period of car bombings and repression. And like the one side, the Labour side would get hold of the voter registry, and if your family voted Labour, you might be beaten up, or your front door set on fire, things like this. So it was quite a terrible period, and they finally got out from under that and got that guy out of power. He died while I was there, actually. He was an old man then. And it sort of seemed like they turned over a new leaf. Things were on the up. Malta joined the European Union, and it seemed to be kind of an up-and-coming place. And then there was an election, and everything changed. This guy, Joseph Muscat, who came in as prime minister, he was young and charismatic, and he was promising this great vision of, sort of a progressive society. And the old people all said, don't believe it. Labour never changes. And so when power changes hands in Malta, the new government removes the supporters of the other party and fills every position with supporters of their own. So like right down to the village level. Like my wife went to the pharmacy one morning, came back and said, like, the lady's gone that we used to see there. And when she asked them, was the business sold? They said, no, there was an election. So they just replaced absolutely everybody. So politics becomes kind of a zero-sum game, one side against the other. You're either Labour or nationalist. Your family voted Labour or nationalist going back generations. And if the other party gets in, it's often an existential threat to you, because you might lose your job, you might lose your contacts for getting building permits regularized, or fast track to a medical appointment or something. Everything is taken care of by these politicians who act as sort of patrons in exchange for votes. And people will trade their vote for whatever it is they want at the time in the election. So it's sort of divided into two hostile camps in a winner-take-all political game, dominated by clientelism, nepotism, trading in influence. I saw it. I was there for a second election after that when Joseph Muscat, corruption was on the ballot. There was a major scandal, and he called a snap election to try to save his sinking administration, and he was voted in with an even larger majority. Really? But at that time, they were sending ministers, government ministers would send baskets of fruit to people with their picture on it, like Minister Chris Fern, oranges from the health minister, and cheap wine from another guy. And then there were phone calls. People were getting phone calls saying, I'm calling from Minister Bonici's office. Do you need anything? Can we do anything for you? This was the justice minister. So they reinstated all these guys who've been fired by the police for being, out of shape or unfit, or one guy had beaten his wife. They reinstated those guys because they're supporters of their party. So just a massive, people often put up illegal buildings and then try to get it regularized later. And right before the election, like hundreds of permits went through to regularize all these illegal buildings. So, it's just a massive vote buying exercises, and he got an even larger majority despite the Panama Papers, despite the scandals. So it became it felt like the country was kind of on the up, but it also felt like kind of the bounds were slipping, and more shady businesses were being attracted to the country, and it sort of cascaded. It's like these new riches that were coming in. They were all based on short-term things and vice, but people kind of got caught up in it. I got the sense, and they liked the improvement in living standards. They liked the easy money, but they didn't want to look too closely at where it was coming from. And the government of Joseph Muscat was driving it.
Joining the European Union, some of the conditions that have to be met can be real sticking points. I don't remember which Eastern European country was trying to join, but they were told, like, if you don't stop using this kind of pesticides in your agriculture, you're not going to be able to join the European Union. With Malta, it seems to me that it's a society that doesn't adhere to a rule of law.
Not in the least,
I'm
no.
interested in even before this election occurred, how is it that the European Union invited them in or accepted them in?
I don't remember who joined at the same time. Several countries were admitted at the same time, and Malta's quite important strategically. And at the time, the government was quite good there. Like the government that was in place when I arrived, they'd been in power for a long time. They were kind of old and tired, and it was probably time for a change. They were a bit complacent, but they had corruption scandals, and they were dealt with. Unlike the following government under Joseph Muscat, who defended these guys and refused to fire them. So it was a different place then. It was seen as they kind of turned the corner from the dark years under Don Mintoff, and they'd earned their place there. They were well respected then. There were some ongoing problems, like the tax structure has always been a thorn in the side of Europe. It's a tax haven for European companies, and the bird poaching still is in the courts now. They basically shoot everything that flies over, endangered species, anything else, and the government would keep applying for these derogations to allow them to keep doing this, and that finally came to a head in recent years. So there were minor issues like that, but it wasn't the place that it is now. And now that they're in, the problem is there doesn't seem to be a mechanism for disciplining countries that aren't fulfilling their side of the bargain. Like Malta gets a lot of transfer payments, and they're quite happy to accept all these EU-funded projects. But then when it comes to fulfilling their side of the bargain, they just usually ignore it, it seems. So, and the EU is toothless to do anything about it. There's no mechanism for kicking a country out or suspending them, or none of these things were thought through, I don't think, when the EU, it was a very naive project in some senses, because nobody could imagine some of the things that are happening there now.
You mentioned some trends of Chinese investment in Malta, and that's sort of a way for them into the European Union. Interested to see how that's going to play out over the next, say, 10 years.
They're bogged down in bureaucracy and legal mechanisms. Like quite regularly, they were sending, especially under Joseph Muscat's period of governance, they were sending rule of law delegations down to the island, and they would investigate these things and come back horrified and write these reports and shake their finger. And they did it over and over again. They sent commissions down there that said, you have to change these things. Malta always said, yes, 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 we'll do it, and then just didn't. And it's because it's such a small place, it kind of falls through the cracks as well. Like, it's a small country. The economy is not that big for the EU. They've got such bigger concerns that I think Malta always just flies under the radar, despite some of the stuff that's going through there now. Like, absolutely everything is running through the island. It's pretty amazing, some of the scams some of the scams and shady dealings, from selling EU passports to fuel smuggling from Libya. That's in the news again recently. Human trafficking. There was slave labor on the island when I was there. What else? The tuna laundering, that was a big one. Money laundering through shell corporations, the gaming companies, online gaming companies. The Italian police called it an ATM for the Italian mafia. They were laundering tons of money through there. The property market is riddled with it. The tuna ends up in Japan, some of the laundered tuna.
Does it?
I've seen it on shelves in northern Japan. That was an interesting scam, because there's always somebody involved in government who's turning a blind eye to these things. Like the Spanish police caught them, just as the Italian police always catch them gaming laundering. It never happens in Malta. They don't catch them, but it was a minister for fisheries, or somebody high up in the fisheries ministry, was signing off on the permits. But basically these fish farm operators, tuna farm operators, were putting in like maybe twice as much as they were supposed to be growing in these tanks. And they'd send the legitimate shipment to Malta, and then they'd make duplicate paperwork and send the others to Japan, for example. And this lady was busted on a call. Like, they have her recorded saying, well, I'm in Brussels for you, so when are you going to give me a little back here? She was suspended with pay, and nothing ever happened. They lock these things in sort of a legal limbo where the person hasn't been convicted yet, so they're not guilty, but they're not innocent either. And they just leave it in like Schrodinger's cat in this, and just delay it as long as possible till everybody forgets about it. Meanwhile, these officials are still collecting their pay. And so that's how most things are dealt with. There's so many scandals like this that you just lose track of them all. I mean, just trying to write about it was quite difficult. The journalists involved get confused.
I thought something similar when I was reading it. I was thinking about the amount of research you had to do to get all of these facts straight and the chronology straight. There were a lot of details, and
that's just like one or two threads. There are multiple massive stories going on simultaneously, and I couldn't possibly include them all without just either writing an encyclopedia or confusing even myself.
We still need to discuss one final topic before we finish. We discussed some of the scandals and corruption that was occurring regularly in Malta's institutions, and how most in society didn't speak out openly against these major problems. But there was a journalist who did regularly report about corruption in Malta, and she became a major part of your book, A Sunny Place for Shady People. Her name was Daphne Caruana Galizia. Could you introduce her and say a little about how she was working to expose scandal and corruption?
So she was the most widely read newspaper columnist in the country. She was the first to write under her real name during that. She grew up in that repressive era of the Mintoff era. So she had a keen sense of injustice from that, and a very uncompromising personality and a keen investigative instinct. Her column was incredibly popular in the Malta Independent, and then she started a website called Running Commentary so that she could write more often than just a once-a-week column that everybody was reading. She published multiple stories a day, and over time she developed this network. She called it her network of spies who would tip her off to everything that was going on. But in a small place like that, you have to understand who's connected to who's related to who used to work for which guy, and she had this all mapped out in her head. And by the time the major political crisis struck in the country with the publication of the Panama Papers that put Joseph Muscat's government under such pressure, her website was getting more traffic than all the newspapers on the island combined. So like everybody was reading her. And she was either revered by one side, secretly revered because nobody wanted to talk about the fact that they were reading her, and just despised by the other side because she exposed all these corruption cases at a very high level and a very sophisticated level. But she also wrote some of what she wrote about verged on kind of village gossip, maybe. Like she would take down a peg ministers who were just acting like total hicks and, just unacceptably embarrassing behavior on the part of a government official. And I think she got so mad about that because she felt like people deserve more than this from their public officials. So when she'd catch somebody with their nose in the trough or just behaving appallingly, she would just rip a shred off these people, and that made her hated by quite a lot of Maltese, because you're writing about somebody that other people know or might be related to. But so her writing, she had a great sense of irony, which doesn't go over well in Malta. People kind of miss that. And she was scathing. Her writing style was very clean, direct, in a place where most writers are quite bloated and meandering. So by the time the political crisis struck, she was basically the opposition in the country. Like the opposition parties had been neutralized and they were completely ineffective. And the prime minister in that snap election in 2017 that I mentioned was saying, if you want to know who's tarnishing Malta's name abroad with all these stories and this corruption stuff, you might want to go to Bidnia, which was the village where she lived. Like they were putting her face on billboards. So like the entire weight of a government, an EU government, was coming down on this one journalist. And they kind of isolated her in this way. People are very timid in Malta and afraid to stand up. So everybody else cowered below the parapet and let her be the person that exposed everything and took all the brunt of it. And so by the time she was killed, she was just despised by total strangers who had never read her work and seen as the opposition by the government. There was a childhood friend of the prime minister who ran a counter blog to her website from the prime minister's office, being paid public funds just to attack her personally, like to stalk her when she was walking around and photograph what she was wearing and stuff. Like just for this is an EU government, it's astonishing. So they hated her because she wasn't afraid of them, and she wouldn't back down despite the lawsuits and the libel suits that they used to try to just bankrupt her. She just wouldn't stop writing no matter how unpleasant it got. They killed her pets in the 80s, slit their throats of their dogs. They tried to burn her house down. So she was about the only threat in the country at the time that all this corruption was coming out. And that's why she was targeted. And
she was on to quite a big story in 2016, 2017. The thought is that it's not what she had written in the past. It's what she was working on uncovering at the moment. Is that right?
Yeah, there was everything points to this massive public-private partnership called Electrogas. It was a power station project, and she had received a data leak from a whistleblower within this organization, and they knew that some data had been leaked. It didn't come out till long after she died that that's what she was working on, but she was close to figuring this out. So when the Panama Papers came out in, what was that, 2016, I think? It was a big data hack from a law firm Panama city called Mossack Fonseca, and it kind of exposed how the world's rich avoid taxes legally by using offshore structures run by nominee directors and things like that. And it caused a big scandal because there were a lot of famous names on the list and a lot of former politicians, but only one EU country had a sitting government minister on the list. And this was the energy minister. And the data leak revealed that two top government officials in Malta, the energy minister and the prime minister's chief of staff, opened secret Panama companies within days of being elected to power. And there was a third company whose the beneficial owner of which would be so sensitive that they would only name it over Skype, so the name doesn't show up in the... So who's more sensitive than the chief of staff, the most powerful man in the country? So the timing of that suggests that this was planned in advance, because there are a lot of documents to gather, notarized documents, proof of the source of funds. Like this isn't something you just whip up and walk into PC Financial and come out with a bank account in 20 minutes. So the fact that they rolled out this as soon as they were successfully elected shows that they were kind of waiting to see if it would work. So the Electrogas power station project that she was working on, this took several years to come out, all these details, but one of the main people behind it was the country's wealthiest businessman, a guy called Jürgen Fenech. It came out bit by bit that he owned a secret Dubai company called 17 Black, and that was listed as one of the main sources of funds for the secret Panama companies owned by the energy minister and the chief of staff and another guy, or the other anonymous one. They were expecting to receive something like $5,000 a day just from that company alone. And he was one of the head architects of the power station company. So it's alleged that the kickbacks were supposed to pass through this company. And so the connections between big business in Malta and top politicians, that was a threat, because if she exposed all of this, these kickbacks, potential kickbacks, alleged kickbacks, then the project would be halted, obviously, and it would all fall apart, and the road to riches would fall apart. But also, the Electrogas project at that time was just barely surviving, and it had been financed by a massive, secretly government-backed loan. So had she exposed that this project is potentially massively corrupt, that loan would be called in, and it could have caused a banking crisis in the country. Like, I think it could have collapsed the finances of the country. So for all these reasons, it seemed like it was a massive threat for that stuff to come out, and they were expecting it any time. So all of this was happening around the timing when she was killed. It was around the time of that snap election. Apparently her murder was put off until the election could be successfully won, and then it was put on again, according to the phone intercepts and the WhatsApp messages they found on the accused mastermind's phone. So the ties between big business in Malta and all these politicians, many of whom were childhood friends, just goes through every level of this corruption story. And she was killed with a massive car bomb just down the road from her home. There were multiple car bombs while we lived there, maybe 8 or 10 in the 6 years I was there. But that was the first one that wasn't an underworld hit. That was a targeted political killing.
It was quite difficult details to read about. There were 2 explosions in the car and not to get too graphic, but took both of them to kill her.
So I think it was the detonator fired off, and then the killers had strapped a bottle of petrol to the bomb to make sure it really went up big enough to do the job. So the primary explosion, and a neighbor who was driving towards her up the hill who testified to this said he heard a bang, and then he saw her screaming and panicking and trying to stop the car, and then just a huge ball of fire engulfed it. And it just left a scattered trail of body parts all over the road and the burning shell of a car. And the worst part about that was within hours of her death, pictures of the accident scene and the murder scene and the body parts were circulated on social media and taken at the crime scene, obviously by the police. And the people in closed Labour Party social media groups were celebrating her death, laughing about it and cheering about it and posting all these horrible memes. And these groups included senior politicians. And the Shift News in Malta infiltrated these groups, and you can see this online. Like this investigation is still available on their website. So half the island was horrified, and then half the people were celebrating and happy about it. And so it's pretty. It wasn't an easy thing to write about, but and that's a section I won't read if I'm asked to read from the book. But I think it's important to show the brutal realities of it and not look away. It's too easy to gloss over what was done to this person simply because of what she wrote about. And I think it's important to see it in all its horrible details and to hear what the hitmen said and how they talked to each other. And the truth isn't pretty, and I think it's necessary to look at it.
Yeah, I agree. After this happened, one of her friends started the Shift to try and continue Daphne's work. You've also been working for them since 2017. We're now 8 years on. Has everyone involved in the assassination of an EU journalist been brought to justice?
So I'll go down the list of the end results. The hitmen, the two hitmen who placed the bomb in her car, they were convicted. I think it was last year, after 5 years of saying nothing and 5 years of pre-trial delays. They had, one of them blurted it out on a podcast from prison that they had been behind this murder. They were convicted and they got 40 years. Their accomplice, these were two brothers, and all the car bombs on the island stopped when they were put in jail, funny enough. Like, everybody knew who was doing this. Their accomplice, who kind of acted as a lookout, he turned state's witness and got 15 years. The middleman in the assassination, who confessed, he was picked up on a money laundering charge and confessed to this. He got a total pardon for being an informant. The guy that he accused was Jürgen Fennick, the island's richest businessman, who owned the high up in the electric gas consortium and who owned 17 Black. He was in pretrial custody for 5 years or something, delaying. He was only arrested about 2 years after. So they got the hitmen fairly quickly because one of the security service guys called in the Americans and Dutch experts to trace the phone signal that detonated the bomb, and then he told his superiors what he had done. So they were kind of in a corner and they had to investigate this, and they busted those two guys, put them in jail, and they tried to treat it as case closed. But it was obvious they're not looking for the reason behind, who hired these guys and why. It was only a couple of years later that Jürgen Fennick was finally exposed when they arrested that middleman, and he named him. He tried to run away on his yacht that same night. He was sending constant text messages back and forth to the chief of staff, the prime minister's chief of staff. Are they coming today? Are they coming? And he's no. And the last guy he talked to was the prime minister's chief of staff before he tried to cut and run. So these guys they had WhatsApp groups together. It's been in the courts lately how the chief of staff tried to derail the investigation. There was a lot of political pressure to make sure nobody dug much deeper. So he was in pretrial custody for years, and they just let him out about a little less than 2 weeks ago. He's out on bail now, and I don't think he'll see another day in prison. His trial hasn't started yet, and they've never looked into the politicians. So there have been a couple of magisterial inquiries. This is a thing in Malta where it's like a compilation of evidence, and a magistrate conducts these inquiries and they decide whether or not to have enough to prosecute. Citizens could request this. So the government kept roadblocking it. The police took no action. They didn't investigate the Panama Papers. They did nothing. So citizens started taking these stories based on reporting by the Shift News, Caroline's project, and others, and taking them to a magistrate and requesting that they look into this. And Joseph Muscat has since been charged with corruption under a different scandal, the hospital scandal. The electric gas thing is now, charges are supposed to be laid any day now against a couple of those guys. So some of these things are making their way to the courts, but the government now, Joseph Muscat was driven from power after this guy was arrested by massive protests, and he put his handpicked successor in place, the guy, as prime minister. So that's just continuity. It's the same parties in power, and they're right now, this week, trying to ram through legislation that would close that loophole so that citizens can no longer request these magisterial inquiries. So that was the only loophole that left these guys vulnerable. The police were compromised. All the institutions were compromised because the heads of them all are appointed by the prime minister in Malta. So none of them had taken action on any of this or tried to dig any deeper. And now they're trying to close off the potential for people to spark these inquiries. And I think they'll try to get the current inquiries killed off as well. And then they'll be untouchable. So basically, the only people that really got punished were the two guys that were hired to plant the bomb in the car. And everybody else is, unfortunately, I think it's very likely they'll all walk away. Because the trial of that businessman will drag on forever. And he knows too much about too many powerful people. If all the the pretrial evidence is even a fraction of it proves to be accurate, which, I mean, that's the case that I lay out in my book. He knows too much about too many powerful people for him to go down. And he said when he was arrested, if I go down, you'll all go down with me. So I don't think anything will happen to any of them, not in Malta. The entire system is compromised. The institutions are compromised, and the current government is just as corrupt as the previous one. So, so basically, there's been no justice in this case.
How have people in Malta reacted to the publication of your book, A Sunny Place for Shady People?
I don't know, actually. Yes, I get some emails. I had trouble getting it sold in Malta for a long time. I have an American publisher, and they couldn't get it distributed on the island because the freelance sales rep for the distributor took exception to it, and they wouldn't give me details. But right now, there's a paperback edition published locally by a publisher called Mid-Sea Press. So it is available now in island bookstores. And I get emails from people pretty regularly, like 2-3 times a week, saying, I left a long time ago, or like basically they're disgusted with the current situation. They've either left the place or would like to leave. And I mean, they all seem to agree with what I've written and don't know where to turn, basically. And I've had several people thanking me for writing it, which surprised me. So I expected a lot more hate mail, to be honest, because it's a pretty dark story, and I was fairly uncompromising about it. But I did try to capture some of the things I really liked about the island, especially in the early years, and some of the things that the old people used to tell me about how different it was before this current corrupt regime took over. I think the roots of it all are in the culture, and I think that's what enabled them to take over in the way that they have. I mean, I wrote about that at great length, but it wasn't always like this, and the current government is responsible for quite a lot, but it wouldn't have happened unless people wanted it to, and we're happy to cash in on it. So that's a complicated story.
The last question I'll ask you is interested what's next, to the degree that you can talk about it. What are you working on these days?
I finished another travel book that I just started sending around. It's a memoir. It's about an earlier journey I did, but it was the last big journey I did at the end of the analog era. So I'm kind of casting it as a memoir, but also examining how things changed, how travel changed with internet, and how it kind of changed us. And I'm partway. I've just finished the first draft of a novel as well. So that's something I didn't think I would ever do, but that's the current thing.
Well, I look forward to reading both those books when they're published, and hopefully we can meet again online or in Japan the next time you and your wife are here. I'm also interested in having more conversations with you about past travel writers and travel writing in the 21st century. So maybe we can do this again sometime soon.
Sure, yeah, anytime.
That's great. I enjoyed the conversation, Ryan. Thanks for joining me today.
All right, thank you for asking me.